From the Sumaira Foundation, this is Demystifying NMO and MOG, where we bring together the world's foremost experts, the doctors dedicated to studying it, and the patients who live with it every day. With support from Genentech. Welcome back for another episode of the podcast. We are back following a small mid-season break thanks to COVID. Today we're fortunate enough to be speaking with Anessa Powell of AllAbility Recruiting. 2013, she was diagnosed with Addison's disease, and she quickly found herself working to raise awareness as a rare disease advocate. This led her to start AllAbility Recruiting along with her husband Bill, where they focus on disability employment, training, and consulting. It's enough for me though. Let's get to it. Anessa, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. Can you please tell our audience more about yourself?
Sure. And thank you so much, Brian. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Anessa Powell, and I'm founder and CEO of AllAbility Recruiting. That's my professional side, owning a disability employment recruitment firm. Personal side, I am a wife, a mom to two incredible teenagers. I have one daughter who's about to graduate high school, so life is changing for us as she goes off to college in a few months. And then my son is graduating 8th grade, so he'll be going into high school. And then, a part of me, I say it's not all of me, but it's definitely a part of me, is my rare disease diagnosis. I was diagnosed in 2013 with Addison's disease, which is a rare autoimmune disease. So I have the lovely opportunity of having multiple autoimmune diseases, but Addison's is definitely the primary one that rules my life. But because of that, it's led to me to where we are now with the company.
So can you tell us more about AllAbility Recruiting and kind of what you do and actually how you ended up there?
Yeah, it's been a wonderful ride and a long ride. So I will start from my diagnosis. That was my first foray into the world for me personally of invisible disabilities, and but you don't look sick is the hashtag that's pretty predominant out there on social media. However, when I was a child, my dad was in a car crash and was hit by a drunk driver when I was 10 years old. So he sustained a traumatic brain injury, a TBI. So that was my first introduction of that whole world and seeing how people were reacting to him, expecting him to be the same person, and quickly learning after talking to him, he was not the same as he was before the accident. So grew up definitely aware of that. My close friend in high school, actually, this was the early 90s, she was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And that at that time was very rare and unknown. This was before it was definitely a more common diagnosis now for people in this area. But that was another opportunity for me to learn and to soak up what it means for those that had she had really hard mobility issues and she wasn't able to go to high school full time. So that was for another introduction. And then the irony is not lost on me. Many years later, when I was diagnosed with my rare disease after the birth of my son, my health decided to take a sideways turn. In my former life, I was an event planner for Marriott hotels and then became a stay-at-home mom. And I had every intention of going back to work once my son went off to elementary school. And that's when my health went really crazy. And then with my diagnosis, here I was diagnosed and I wasn't sure what life was going to look like for me being a mom, but also working full time. And so that's how I really just threw myself into research and networking because, as you know, Brian, when you are diagnosed with something rare, you are oftentimes the only person in the room who knows about it,
Absolutely.
Even with speaking with medical professionals. So I really wanted to understand what this life was going to be like for me. Here I am having to take medication to live. If I don't have this medication, I will end very painfully for me. So how do you go about taking care of yourself and working full time? And as I learned through really just my research and through talking with people online and in person, there was a vast pool of people out there with disabilities, such as myself, that really wanted to get back into the workforce, but they had gaps in their resumes and really just were struggling to be seen for the abilities they can bring, not what they are lacking. Fast forward a few years later, the pandemic hit, changed everything for my family. My husband had been in corporate America for over 20 years and was looking at his next opportunity and was working with a recruiter. I actually was really trying to get back into the workforce as well, but more on the patient advocacy side, because I had found this new passion of mine of working with other patients such as myself and feeling like they had an opportunity to be heard and understood as well. And I was working with a disability recruiter. We both were not wowed by our experiences. We just kind of looked at each other one day. It was very much a lightning bolt moment for us. And we said, you know what? We're going to start this company, and it's going to be out of a lens that oftentimes is overlooked, and that's the people with disabilities, and trying to give them an opportunity to get their foot in the door, and really just giving them the opportunity just to be able to interview who may have been overlooked in the past. So we launched AllAbility Recruiting. We are coming up on our 2-year anniversary. It's been a wonderful organic ride of people truly learning about us, but also understanding what we are. We're unique in our approach because we're very much a people first firm. And after we launched, we quickly learned that businesses want to do the right thing. They don't oftentimes, though, know how to begin. So we created our training sessions, and that's where we go into companies, businesses, organizations, and help walk them through disabilities. We started Disability 101, start the very basic, like what even is qualifying as a disability, all the way through fostering support for those that are currently within your organization that have disabilities, interviewing, maintaining accommodations. And then the final piece to our training session is that culture, and how culture is vital in order for doing disability employment correctly, and why it matters to your bottom line. And let me assure you, it's tenfold to your bottom line when you are doing it right. So we walk them through that. So we have that piece, and we started that out. And then our clients would be like, well, that was great. So where do we go now? And we're like, okay. So now we do consulting, and that's where we really get an opportunity to come in and look at the full life cycle of employees and get our arms around it. Everything from the application process. Is it accessible? Interviewing, is your staff prepared to interview someone who's deaf? Is your staff prepared for someone who's on the spectrum? And walking it through, and then supporting them once they're hired. So we're, as we like to say, all things disability employment related.
That's incredible. The gap that you were able to find and really get into, and really find those unmet needs, both on the side of, someone who's looking for work, but also in creating that environment and helping organizations develop the protocols they need and the processes and everything. That's fantastic. Do we have an idea of how many people there are with disabilities in the workforce currently?
There are 33 million working age adults here in America. So when you're looking around your workforce, and if you're listening to the podcast, there are 1 in 4 people in your organization that have a disability. So if you're looking around and you're saying, I don't know anybody with a disability, let me assure you that you do. They have just not felt comfortable to disclose for various reasons. And that's a whole other topic that we can certainly get into. But 1 in 4 is the one that really hits home for people.
Wow, I never would have realized that it was that many people. From what I understand, that during the pandemic, that number, or post-pandemic, that number has increased. So what are some of the common challenges and barriers that people with disabilities face when they're looking for employment? And how do you fit into helping them overcome those challenges?
There's every candidate has a story to tell. So we've learned so much from everyone that we speak with. And I think the biggest obstacle for them, and I experience this myself, and just people don't see the person, they see the disability. And it can be a very different experience for someone who has a visible disability, or in someone with invisible or non-apparent, whichever word you like to use to describe that. So I fall into that invisible category, of that 70% of disabilities are invisible. And I think the biggest challenge for them is that when they disclose, then they're seen as the person with a disability. They're not seen as someone who can bring their talents to the table. The beauty of what I do, and what we really enjoy at AllAbility Recruiting, is that I'm not bound by the ADA laws. Like, this person's not coming to work for me. I can intimately find out about this person and the disability that they have, and any accommodations that they may need. Some of ours don't need accommodations, but Some do. So I can really find out what's going to help them succeed in their job. And the great thing is when you are working with us, and if you're a client that is working with us, you already know that I'm going to be presenting to you a particular candidate that may need accommodations, and we're going to walk them through that process. So say, for instance, a person, and I had this actually a few weeks ago, I have a candidate who is legally blind. They can do their job beautifully. They just need a larger screen monitor. That's an easy fix. So I can make sure if I'm sending this person in for the interview, they're already prepared for that and they already have it on their radar. So if we hire this person, then we're going to make sure that that accommodation is going to be taking place. So stuff like that. For us, it's about communication. I'm not going to put a candidate in a position where I feel like they're not going to succeed. And also it's not going to be a win-win for both sides. It's going to be a good match, and they're going to make sure that both are feeling like this is going to succeed for each of them.
How would someone with disabilities, what is the best way to kind of start looking and trying to find opportunities for employment? There's so much out there. There's all the different websites. And I remember when you used to have to get the Sunday paper and go through and start circling things.
Yes.
To date myself a bit.
Well, there's lots of avenues in which someone with a disability, and like I said, there's so many that don't even need accommodations. And some don't, and there's a lot that don't disclose. So it kind of depends on your comfortability factor. But first and foremost, it's just the traditional route of applying online and going through that process. However, some that need assistance in applying because it's not accessible for them based upon their disability. So that's where you can work with a disability recruiter like us, where we can help walk you through the process and kind of cut through that for you to help. As well as the company side of it, we're trying to work with companies to make sure that their platform is accessible in order you don't have that opportunity. But say, for instance, you are just a traditional candidate that applies through their website and you get that interview. I always tell our candidates is that you want to make sure that this is going to be an environment where you can be you. Masking is a term that's a hot button that is really more prevalent in the neurodivergent category. So someone, say, for instance, who is on the spectrum, or someone who has ADHD, ADD, dyslexia, they mask at work, which basically means they're hiding their true self. They're afraid to share the challenges that they're facing at work. And some would say faking it, some would say masking, some would say playing a role in order to do their job correctly. And if that is something that you are not comfortable in doing, then you want to be in an environment where you say, hey, this is me and I have dyslexia and this is what I need in order to do my job correctly. And this is how I'm going to feel supported. And you have a company that reacts, shall we say, negatively to your disclosure, then this is not an environment where you want to work. This is something that you want in order to feel yourself. And so you need to continue on your search. That's a big challenge. And that's what we try to work through our clients with, is like, if someone is sharing this with you, that's a vulnerability factor. In order to respond correctly, you need to know how to respond correctly. So we help them through that. So, but for someone who's applying directly, just open eyes and being able to kind of understand that there are businesses out there that want to do it right, and you just have to find them.
I was recently reading some research that had come out specifically about NMO and MOG and the impact it had on employment. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting was, and you've touched on a little bit, is that some patients had chosen not to disclose their illness. So as an employee, do you have to disclose your illness? Should you, what is the thought process, the pros and cons of disclosing versus not disclosing?
This is the $1 million question. We get this question all the time. And I actually recently did a talk on this for a convention, and, and it's very nuanced. And I would say the answer to that is it's personal and it's your decision. And that's what it boils down to. So briefly, to cover what the ADA is defined by here in America, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so it was created in the 90s for protection of those with disabilities within the workforce and throughout the country as well, outside of the workforce, for accessibility. But I'll start with the work part of that. So you do not have to disclose ever that you have a disability. The time comes, though, when you are needing accommodations in order to do your job successfully. That's when disclosure happens. There are people that have been diagnosed with a particular, you name it, and they've been working there for years and they've never told anyone. And then something happens and now, okay, now I need to have accommodation in order to do my job. And that's when they disclose. So you can disclose 2 weeks after being hired. You can disclose 10 years after being hired. So that timeline is totally up to you. You are not bound to it by any means, and you do not ever have to tell. There are lots of people that work that have never shared, oh yeah, I have lupus, or I have, you name it. There's so many ways that people don't. Obviously, visible disabilities is a very different scenario. Now, with the working part of it for the accommodations, that's, like I said, there's that vulnerability piece to it. There is always a question in the back of your mind. If I disclose this, is there going to be stigma against me? Am I going to be discriminated against when it comes to, say, for instance, they're going to be giving us pay raises? Am I going to be included in that? Or are they going to be thinking in the back of their mind, oh, this person is going to be out so much for their medical off, they're costing us so much in medical bills, or they're thinking about that. There's a lot to it, and it is very personal for someone if they choose to disclose or not to disclose.
I guess it's one of those questions that just depends, and you have to go off that gut feeling of what the process is like. You brought up the ADA, and I know that can be an entire season of podcasts in and of itself. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? There are so many common misconceptions. People just kind of hear things, and that just becomes folklore of sorts. So does it apply to all companies and all employers? Do they have to abide by it? And are there rights that are guaranteed, or how do the protections work? Can you tell us a little bit more about that, maybe?
Yeah, so the ADA is definitely nuanced, and they did a nice job in a sense that they've left it broad enough. So when you look at the list of disabilities that are covered under it, they obviously haven't listed every single one. But if, for instance, if I were to look at the list and see where I would fall under that, it's under the autoimmune category. And there's so many they couldn't list all 200 of them, or you name it, how many we have now. They keep adding. And they recently did add long COVID to the list because clearly this was not something that was in the 1990s when they created the ADA. So it can be adapted. Right. So that part of it, the list of coverage of diseases is there. And basically it also means it can be something that has affected you in the past that can still be affecting you now. So say, for instance, you had cancer and you've gone through treatment for it, and you now have what they like to call chemo brain. It can still affect you as a part of your job. And so you might need accommodations for that. Even though you were diagnosed with cancer 10 years ago, it can be still something that you're covered under according to the laws with the ADA. So that's a part of it with regards to the definition itself. And it was created in order to protect those with individuals, but it's also created for companies too, to make sure that they're in line with how to better support not only their employees, but their customers. And as we like to say, ADA is not optional, guys. I mean, this is something that you have to really, really make sure that you're on top of when it comes to accommodations and stuff. So I will tell you, this is where companies really get into trouble, is because the number one lawsuits with the EEOC that are filed are because of disability accommodations. And what happens is the companies are immediately denying them, and they're saying, nope, we can't do that. They're not engaging in that interactive process. And the way it works is if a particular employee asks for accommodation, then the company is supposed to take it and say, okay, let's see how we can figure this out. And they're supposed to, what they call it in the engagement interactive process. Companies get in trouble when they immediately deny someone. So say, for instance, I'll use this as an example. Someone with a wheelchair needs to have a particular type of desk in order for their wheelchair to fit under. They may not even know what type of desk they need. They just Google it and they say, this is the size. And they Google it and the first one that pops up is $10,000, right? Well, the company's like, no, we're not going to get that desk for you because it's $10,000. If they would have engaged in the process and gone back and forth, they could easily have found one that was, $2,500 if they had gone and included the person who's requesting it in the interactive process and asked and gone back and forth. So that part of it is probably what people hear the most of, is like this so-and-so is being sued because they were discriminatory against someone who is disabled, or they fired someone who was because they were disabled. That's because they haven't really understood the way in which to it. And there's an old saying within the disability community, nothing about us without us, is basically include us in the conversation, making sure, and that's all anyone wants to do, is make sure that they feel like they're a part of that if it is pertaining to them.
So accommodations aren't necessarily guaranteed, but the organization does at least have to make a good faith effort and engage in the conversation and look for options to determine the reasonableness of a request.
Absolutely. And every person is different. So say, for instance, you have someone who is visually impaired. That's them and their accommodations that they may need. And then you may have another employee who's visually impaired and may need different accommodations. No two people are alike and no two disabilities are alike. So it definitely have to engage. You can't, as a company, just put a flat out, this is what we're going to do, and this is going to apply to every single person. And that's not how it works. So you do have to do that, and you have to walk through that process. And yes, the accommodations have to be reasonable. Like, for instance, if you're someone who's saying, I need to have every second day off from work for my mental health, well, the productivity factor is going to be in question there, right? So you have to kind of engage in what that looks like for you and making sure that you are going to be productive. Your mental health is still going to be intact, but you're also a good employee too. So it has to be able to be a win-win for both sides.
So definitely the underlying theme here is there needs to be a lot of communication to find that balance of what's in the best interest of the organization and of the employee. So that communication piece, even going back to disclosing an illness and then asking for an accommodation, any suggestions on how to have those conversations?
I always say, don't let it be the elephant in the room. That's probably the most frustrating part, is when these conversations are being had and they're about you and you're not included in them. Horrible. I hate that. You have to engage in this process with the person. So, say, for instance, you have someone who is bringing in an emotional support animal where, they're in the office now. And so have you prepared accordingly your staff in which ways to interact or not to interact? So that's just I've got off on a tangent on that one. But, the biggest thing is that if you have the conversations from the very beginning, and that's going back to disclosing, and I will say this before, is that I always tell our candidates, I always encourage them to disclose from the beginning, because it's a lot easier. And especially when you're talking about someone who has a rare disease or who has autoimmune conditions. I joke, autoimmune, they don't like to just stay with just one. They like to collect over time. And so if your employer is already aware that you have this particular condition, then they're not going to be completely blindsided if you come to them and say, hey, it's Wednesday, I got another autoimmune disease. Let's see how I can figure this one out. Can you help me? And they're like, what are you even talking about? So we do always try to encourage that. So if you've already begun the conversation and HR, and depending on the size of the company, already has it in your file, like, look, this particular person has this, and this person is going to need this accommodation. So when you start needing more, if you do, then they're already prepared and have already had that conversation. But if you have something that is brand new, it's vital to start and to share if you feel like it could be something that is going to change over time.
So communication always has to start with the communication.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I know I've struggled with in my work life since I had gotten sick, and I know it's a common topic for others, is kind of navigating work culture. You go through the diagnostic journey, and it really impacts relationships. Coworkers can be unsure of how to respond to you. Things can get kind of awkward. Some people try to overcompensate. They try to overexplain. Others see it as a sign of weakness and try to get over on you or whatnot. So how do you deal with coworkers and try and head off any toxicity or any of that awkwardness?
Well, first, you take our training sessions at AllAbility Recruiting, because this is what we exactly walk businesses through. So like I said, I'm just one of those people. I just don't want it to be the elephant in the room. So like, if, for instance, I had been out and I'm just recently diagnosed, I'm going to come in and I'm going to share, and I'm going to say, look, this is me. I have Addison's disease. Yes, I have to take medicine 4 times a day, and there is a potential that I could go into crisis. In my bag, this is my crisis kit. And if you see me acting weird, or if I'm not with it, or if I pass out, or you name it, this is where my emergency I think bringing people into the conversation is so vital, especially if it's something that could happen at work. And so they know what to do. So they're prepared and they're not like, I didn't even know she was sick, or I didn't even know she had an emergency ejection in her purse. I think that's really something to keep in mind, especially if it's a new diagnosis and you're still trying to figure it out. And I know it's not comfortable, because it's probably, I remember after I was diagnosed, I was like, oh my goodness, I don't know what this new world is like for me now. How do I share it? Or if I share it, and as my husband said, I shared it for everyone just because that was just how I was at that point. That's how I was processing it. Now I've kind of toned it down a little bit, but it's just people react differently. That's that part of it. Now, if from the company business side of it, it all boils down to culture. And I'll use this as an example. Say, for instance, you do have a particular employee that does require a break every hour. Call it the old smoker's break, right? Well, you could have an environment where other employees see that and they're like, well, why is this person getting that break? I don't get that break. That comes back to the culture where you've created the environment where people understand that we support people regardless, and we don't have jealousy, we don't have that toxicity, we don't do that here, because we've talked about it. We've talked about in our training sessions, or we've talked about it in our meetings, our weekly employee meetings, that we don't put up with that. We support people, and if this person is asking for it, then they need it, and we believe them.
Having that support from company, being willing to take a stand and be like, hey, knock it off. We're adults here. We're going to do what's in the best interest of the people and work towards our corporate goals and strategic outcomes. That's definitely important. I know one of the first speaking engagements I had to give once I started back to work was to a group of emerging leaders. We had been doing a long-term emerging leaders workshop, and it was the final session, and I didn't know how to address it or how to approach it. And the consultants that we had worked with, they were like, everybody has an idea of what's going on. Just be honest and get it out there. And so I remember I got up, and glad everyone's here. I'm not drunk. I just got out of the wheelchair a couple weeks ago. If I fall over, give me a few seconds before you jump up. May take me a few minutes, and just kind of made a joke out of it, and definitely saw the tension in the room change because people weren't sure how to respond to it. So I think hitting it head on, and even using a little bit of humor at my own expense, people were like, oh, okay, we can breathe and we can get past it.
People do take the cues from those with disabilities all the time. I see this in our interactions with our candidates and out in the public too, with people who are in wheelchairs, and they are watching your reaction, but the person who doesn't have the disability is especially watching the person with disability and their reaction. So if you are the one that's like, yep, I'm in a wheelchair, this is me, they're much easier and put at ease too, because it's not something that people are comfortable with, unfortunately. And we're out to change that at AllAbility. It's like, a person with a disability is just one person with a disability, and that's just a part of who they are. That's not who they are. And I talk about this all the time on LinkedIn, and just what that looks like for people and understanding. And I posted an article a few months ago about talking to your kids and walking them through that. And that's how it starts. It starts from at home, and, letting them understand that that's just Joe in the wheelchair. That's just not, Joe is not something any different than us. He just happens to not have his legs working, and that's the only thing different. So walking them through that is so important, and sharing. And that's why sharing through podcasts such as this and out in the community, and for people to say, okay, this is the part of who we are. And let me assure you, the thing about disability is that it can be temporary, it can be situational, or it can be permanent. And there will be a time in your life where you too will be facing a disability. And like I said, it could be very, very short-lived, but you will face it.
Absolutely. I think we're seeing it every day more and more. People with disabilities, especially the immunocompromised, one of the things they're struggling with right now is returning to the office, to on-site work, because of the pandemic or post-pandemic.
Right.
There's been so much polarization around COVID, and it's really made it a difficult topic to discuss, whether it's even with our families and at home, but in the workplace. And so we're seeing companies that are starting to bring their employees back on site. Is this part of a continuing trend?
When the pandemic hit, one good thing that I found out of the entire few years of everyone being at home was that it really gave an opportunity for those with disabilities to work. It was not even a question at that point. They were like, yes, we're doing it from home. We're working and we're succeeding. And then when you had the interview process for those with disabilities, it wasn't a question. It was like, yeah, here, you're hired. And my fear was that as companies were trying to return to the office and starting to put those mandates in place, we're going to start to lose out on that talent. And it is happening, and it makes me sad, and it makes me mad, and it makes me angry, because we have in our talent pool for AllAbility Recruiting is that I would say 90% of our candidates want remote work for various reasons. You name it, pain, chronic illness, it just works for them to be able, and they're better employees when they can be in their home environment. And you have companies now that are drawing that line in the sand. They're saying, nope, we got to be back in the office 5 days. And we're like, wait a minute, can you at least have a hybrid approach where they only have to be in 3 days and, they can work from home 2 or what, you name it. And I'm afraid that the disability numbers are going to start plummeting again, the employment numbers, I should say, because of that. And it is worrisome that we have such short memories that people don't recall that, yes, we can be a little bit more adaptive in supporting those that we promised that we would, and now we're not.
That's interesting to see how organizations are either flip-flopping or just trying to feel their way forward. It can be difficult wearing a mask and having conversations or things like that. And I've even heard of people that have returned to the office being asked to remove their mask to give a presentation. I'm in a room full of unmasked people, and I'm wearing one for a reason.
Right.
So any thoughts on the post-COVID work etiquette? I don't think anyone would be like, hey, I need you to present. Can you get out of that wheelchair and go to the front of the room? And
Exactly.
Thoughts on etiquette.
That whole mask debate is just so polarizing. And I've always just, I always come from a place of people are going to let people do what they want to do when it comes to their own bodies. And if you are someone that is concerned about being out and about with your mask and you want to keep it on, I think let them keep it on. I was at a presentation, about a month ago, and the presenter had their mask on the whole time, and she was mic'd appropriately, and it was fine. You kind of forget she's wearing it after a point. So I think people should have, be able to do and support the way that it works best for their health. And if you are someone in the office that needs to wear a mask because you're made to go in the office because you can't work remotely, then my goodness, you better let them wear the mask, because you're putting them in danger. Some people who are required to go back in. So, we could probably talk about that a long time, but that's my 2 cents.
So kind of shifting and talking a little bit more about from the employer point of view, what have you found to be some of the biggest misconceptions about hiring people with disabilities, and how do you address those misconceptions with an employer?
There are a lot that, unfortunately, businesses are starting to, I would say, since there is a talent shortage out there, businesses are starting to understand. And I will tell you that the disability community, we're about 20 years behind in those being hired with people of color and women, especially in leadership roles. We're definitely about 20 years behind. And businesses are starting to take note of that and okay. And the beauty of it, and I say this all the time, is that the disability community is intersectional. So yes, the disability piece is the largest minority group in the world, which most people do not realize, but it touches every other minority group. So when you say you employ people of color or women in leadership roles, you need to make sure you have those with disabilities included in that. And I assure you they are, if they're just not disclosing, because you haven't created that environment where people feel comfortable in disclosing. But, for those that are navigating this world of disabilities and understanding it, for companies, that the bottom line is the talent is out there. Let me assure you, they are there. They are this untapped talent pool that has been there the whole time. And we're sitting over here chanting, yes, we're here. We're here. You need to take note of us. And that's what I love what we do, is that I spend most of my calls, Brian, educating people and having conversations with them and why they need to take notice of the community and what that looks like. And the return on the investment is there. The spending power of this community is phenomenal. And the return on the investment, when I say that, I mean the favorability factor. So if someone knows out in the community that you are someone that employs people with disabilities, or your customers that you're supporting are those with disabilities, then others are going to start flocking to you, and you're going to get so much return on your investment.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. You had talked a little bit earlier about how employers and organizations can go about and create that inclusive and more accessible work environment for employees with disability. In creating that work environment, it seems like it was kind of a leap from the traditional norms that we had pre-pandemic. Do you think the pandemic has really kind of been a paradigm shift in mentality for businesses in terms of reaching out to the disabled community or being able to bring them in and work with them more?
Oh, I hope so. I think the pandemic definitely shifted things for certain industries for sure. So we're talking the hospitality industry, the restaurants, just that is such a labor shortage right now. So they are taking notice and saying, okay, we need to be thinking out of the box and how we can really just not only attract but retain the talent, and that comes from the disability community. They are out there and they're wanting to be employed. Now the challenge is you do have that particular sect, but that's in-person jobs, right? Most of the time hospitality is in person, but when you're talking about remote work, that's what we're trying to focus on too, is that companies, when you were saying, yes, we're so desperate for talent, we need that, well, then we need you to be open to the fact that they can be able to do it remotely. So that is one part of it. I will say, though, you had employees that left before the pandemic that didn't have a disability. And now you have employees returning to the office that are there, that are coming back with mental health challenges. And you have 70% of disabilities are invisible, and the largest piece of that is mental health. And so you've got these new employees, not a new, but you've got these employees that are returning to the office are saying, hey, I need to have PTO or at least have time off and to be supported if I say I need to go meet with my mental health professional, and you're not going to come after me and hold me accountable for that, when it's really, if you want me to be an employee here and be a successful employee, then I really need to have that opportunity to continue my mental health walk. So companies are kind of like, whoa, we need to take note of this and really get our arms around what this looks like. And as we like to encourage our clients, it's like, you say you have a piece now, it's just going to continue to grow. We do have an aging population, but we also have a younger generation that is coming into the workforce that has grown up with 504 plans and IEPs, have learned from their advocates around them that they need to self-advocate. So they're coming into organizations that are saying, hey, this is me. These are accommodations that I need. Can you meet that? And if companies are ready to meet that, guess what? They're moving along, because that is one thing about this younger generation, is they will not stay if they don't feel like they're going to be supported. So if we always say to our clients, look, you got to get your handle on this now before it is too late and you've lost out on some amazing talent.
Yeah, that's a really good example of the market will determine what the market's going to do. So again, from an organizational point of view, you talked about the return on investment of having people with disabilities and making sure that it's inclusive. And for a company who's interested in being able to reach out to the disabled community and help provide opportunities, where would they get started? What would be your advice to them?
So first, like I mentioned, you call AllAbility Recruiting. No, but we always say we want you to absolutely do disability employment, but there's a way in which you do it correctly. There are other businesses, corporations out there that are starting to really invest in neurodivergent talent because they're seeing what they can bring to the company. But I have seen companies do it wrongly. They have hired them because they say, hey, we employ people who are on the spectrum, who are neurodivergent, and then they get there and they don't know how to support them properly. So it has to be done correctly. It has to come from really top to bottom, bottom to top. it can't be just one person in HR driving this culture change. It has to be able to transcend throughout the entire company. And if it's a larger company, it can't be in one division. It has to be throughout. And that's where companies do fail, is if it's in one part and it's not throughout the whole thing. If you say you're committed to this, you got to just talk about it all the time. It can't be 1 month out of the year. October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Look, my calendar is filled with talking engagements that month, which I absolutely love. But November 1st, I'm wide open again. And they stop talking about it. It can't happen 1 month. It has to be talked about every day. And we also talk about in our training sessions, I can't tell you this to you. You take this paperwork back to your desk and you lock it up in your drawer and you forget about it. It has to continue those conversations. So it has to be driven and done properly through the right steps and understanding how to work through that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Anytime an organization is going to try and create change, it really has to be more than just a kitschy motto on a coffee cup. It has to be part of that larger strategic objective. That kind of leads me to my next questions. So the journal article that I had mentioned earlier had spoke about people who were diagnosed at an earlier age. They face more barriers in terms of educational attainment and employment. And I've had a few conversations with parents of young adults with rare diseases, and they're looking at the economy, job reports, etc., and they understand that health insurance is so closely tied to having a job, and it's an incredibly scary time for them when they consider that their child is going to be aging out of their health insurance program. So, do you have any advice for a young person who is finishing up high school or college and they're looking to move into the workforce?
That's it. Every person is different. Like I mentioned, every disability is different. So you have someone who with, mobility, that's a whole other thing too, with making sure you can navigate that process and making sure it's accessible for them. Invisible. And here's the bottom line. The tide is turning. And I'm happy to say that. I see it in my daily walks and my daily talks. People's eyes are opening up to the fact that the disability community is not going to stay quiet any longer. We are very mighty. And it's come a time that it's turning where someone is owning their disability and they're talking about it forthright and they're not afraid to hide it anymore. And that trend is going to continue to change. So companies and businesses have to adapt to that to stay on top of it, like I mentioned, and continue to support that. So I had a mom reach out to me a couple of weeks ago whose son is on the spectrum, and she's like, Anessa, please tell me that there's a future for him. And I'm like, yes, there is. I promise you. And I really am excited. I have a daughter who's hearing impaired, and I see the ways that companies are like, okay, we're going to have a mandate where all of our meetings are going to have captions. And, not only, and that's the beautiful thing about universal design, just real quickly on a tangent, universal design was created originally, like say, for instance, curb cuts in the sidewalk. Those were created for wheelchair users way back in the day. However, if you've ever pushed a baby stroller or if you've ever pushed a shopping cart, you're looking for those curb cuts. So that's universal design because it helps everyone. So when you have captions on your Zoom videos, when you're in a webinar, yes, you're helping those who are hearing impaired, but you're also helping people who have ADD, ADHD, or people who just generally just learn better. I'm a visual learner. I love to read the captions because I soak up the knowledge better that way. So that part of it and having those mandates going forward, people are starting to get on the boat, on the bus, train, you name it. Everyone's starting to get on it and they're starting to understand. So if you're a young person who is out there who is like, okay, I'm going to start getting into this workforce, be your true self, be authentic, and you know what, work for a company that's going to value who you are.
I was actually just going to ask, what is the future of work for people with disabilities? I think you just nailed it. You just nailed it. Excellent.
Oh, good.
I appreciate your time coming on and chatting with us. Where can our listeners find you?
They can find us at AllAbilityRecruiting.com. We're on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn under Anessa Powell, so check me out. Love to have you follow along, especially if you're someone who's really wanting to understand more about the disability space and the employment space. I try to post regularly articles and information out there about how and why it should be cared about.
Thank you very much again. I appreciate it and hope to talk to you again in the future.
Brian, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.